This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
On January 6th of 2021, a remarkable event took place. We watched on cable news as a crowd of supporters of former President Donald Trump made their way inside the United States Capitol. This has been spun and used for political purposes by all sides of the political spectrum, but especially by progressives, by those in Congress, and by their allies in the media who portrayed this and described it as an insurrection. If so, the worst insurrection in history. What really happened on January 6th, when we view this through a supernatural lens? And what does it say about us as a nation and about us as Christians here in America? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me to discuss this tonight, and credit to him for suggesting not only the topic, but the title for this program, Saturn, Cincinnatus, and Civil Religion in America. He is the founder of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, the author of numerous books, which you'll find at his website, burtonbeyond.com. We welcome back to the program our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, thanks for joining us tonight, and this ought to be an interesting discussion.
Thanks for having me. Yes, I agree.
What really struck me, and credit to Sharon for pointing out a lot of this, I tend to look more at what's actually happening on the ground. She's better at recognizing patterns, especially when things are happening in different areas that fit together. She's better about taking the 30,000-foot view and seeing the pattern. She pointed out a couple of really, really interesting things. First of all, and she wrote this for a chapter that will be in Tom Horn's forthcoming book, Zeitgeist 2025, which is really an extension of work that he's done previously, Apollyon Rising 2012 and Zenith 2016, on the occult symbolism embedded in the architecture and the art of the United States Capitol. She pointed out that January 6th is a day that we celebrate as Christians in the Western world as Epiphany. And in the Eastern world, what do they call it? It's I'm forgetting. There's a different title for it, but essentially it means the same thing. It's the day that we celebrate. It used to be called the 12th day of Christmas, the day that the divinity of Christ was revealed to mankind when the three wise men arrived at the manger and acknowledged him as the Savior of the world. So on January 6th, the day that we celebrate is Epiphany, the day of Christ's, the revelation of Christ's divinity. This thing happened inside the Capitol. Now, why is that relevant? Because many of our elected officials, Republican and Democrat, and people in the media kept referring to the United States Capitol over and over again as the temple to democracy. Chuck Schumer, for example, President Franklin Roosevelt set aside December 7th, 1941 as a day that will live in infamy. Unfortunately, we can now add January 6th, 2021 to that very short lists of dates in American history that will equating this with Pearl Harbor. But then he said this temple to democracy was desecrated. Then Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, 2 weeks ago, an angry, violent mob staged an insurrection and desecrated this temple of our democracy. And this was repeated by a number of others. Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming, and this is why she's not a favorite among Republicans anymore, but she said essentially the same thing. Members of the U.S. Capitol Police and across law enforcement are heroes. We saw their heroism in action on January 6th when they defended the most sacred space in our republic against violent insurrectionists. So, you know, this was over and over. I mean, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made another comment similarly, what she describing her the ceremony to swear her in as Speaker over the 117th Congress. We gather under this dome of this temple of democracy. So over and over again, this phrase, temple of democracy, the most sacred space in our republic. Judd, if we're a Christian nation, why would we have a temple of, air quotes now, democracy?
That's a great question, and I love it when Democrats throw that term around as if the pure democracy what we had, number one, in this country, and number two, that it was worth a darn to begin with. It's basically mob rule. I mean, even the Athenians and the Greek city-states that had democracy were rife with problems. You know, it was only moderately efficient on that scale. That's why we have a republic that uses democratic mechanisms, but you can't do it on that's on a nation-state scale. Anyway. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is very interesting. I can remember I read a book in grad school by Robert Bellah called Civil Religion in America. I think that was the title. And in it, he does this very thorough explication of the fact that there is this sort of, kind of quasi-religion that's embodied in the symbols of our national livelihood. That there's a kind of I'm paraphrasing here. I'm trying to remember how he described it. A kind of civil theism. With the founding fathers as kind of the demigods or the gods of the pantheon of our national narrative, and that's very much true. I think Bella, along with other scholars, have demonstrated, that those elements are there. A lot of them are taken from classical antiquity, but even though some of the founding fathers, like Jefferson and Franklin and Adams, who was on a number of occasions vocal about his sympathy and affinity for, of all things, Hindu beliefs, even if there were some founding fathers who sort of marched to the beat of their own spiritual drum, there were others like Washington where it's very difficult to make a case for anything really occult related or nefarious on his part. Even Jefferson, who was, at best a person of his own religious definition, still said that the best place for Americans to learn morality was in the church pew. So he realized the importance of Judeo-Christian tradition in the West in general, and in particular the American civilization that they were building. And so that's why I'm always hesitant to completely demonize founding fathers as if they're part of some sort of nefarious occult agenda, even if there were some plants that were. What is often left out of this discussion is, and I hope I'm not putting the cart before the ox here, but what often gets left out of this discussion is that it was less the founding fathers who deified themselves, and it was more the architects of our earliest national monuments, Washington, D.C., all of these guys like L'Enfant, who basically designed the layout for Washington, D.C. All of these guys were high-ranking Freemasons, probably Illuminized Freemasons, given their kind of leanings. And we can get into the meat and potatoes of this as we go along, but that famous painting of the Apotheosis of George Washington, where he's dressed in classical regalia, which we're also going to talk about, that's related to Saturn. Washington himself, anybody who studied Washington to any great degree would have known that given his character, this would have been something he would have scoffed at completely. So it's what you're looking at. If you're going to look at this from a critical perspective, from the historical perspective, then what you're looking at is a later generation of architects, policymakers, politicians, business owners who were actually responsible for, quote unquote, creating the American pantheon. And that is borne out in, mountains of document evidence. And it really kind of makes me stand back a little bit when I see some documentaries that just completely vilify all of the founding fathers as if they were all involved in some sort of Illuminized conspiracy. And I'll have more to say about that as we go along. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a good place to start, because you begin to get a clearer picture of this connection that this later generation of Illuminized Freemasons who were trying to create this pantheon out of the founding fathers, and with Washington at the very center of it. And of course, the regalia that he's wearing is reminiscent of something that you find in antique Rome, with his garb mm-hmm. and poise, very much as you find Saturn, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I know that you've been doing quite a bit of research on Saturn for your upcoming book, and I see a lot of juxtapositions here, a lot of intersecting trains of thought. I think it's a timely discussion.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad that you suggested this. And again, credit to Sharon, because a lot of what she wrote for Zeitgeist 2025, which SkyWatch TV will start airing programs for in just a couple of weeks, August, that book will hit the airwaves. And there's a lot of pretty, this is going to be another POW. I mean, this year, Tom's Defender Publishing with the follow-up to the Wormwood Prophecy, The Messenger, and with Josh Peck's forthcoming book on the Essenes and their calendar and how that relates to 2025. Some of that information is in Zeitgeist 2025. Donna Howell and Allie Henson, with the research that they've been doing that's gone into this book, is also mind-boggling. And then Sharon's chapter, which I hadn't seen the intersection with what I was working on regarding Saturn until I started to look at what this entity, who this entity was. Just to lay some groundwork for people not familiar with either Zeitgeist or whether either Apollyon Rising 2012 or Tom's expanded edition, the follow-up to that, which was Zenith 2016. In a nutshell, he argues that Freemasonic and other secret society adepts planned the look and the layout of the Capitol and the National Mall, the Washington Monument, as a sort of generative engine, if you will, where the obelisk, that is the Washington Monument, the largest obelisk in the world, comes from the myth of Osiris and Isis in ancient Egypt, where Osiris was attacked by his evil brother Set and his 72 co-conspirators, which is interesting because that's 72. Well, I'm going to rabbit trail here. Yeah, significant number. We'll get to that when we talk about the Apotheosis of Washington. So bookmark that number 72. Anyway, chopped into 14 pieces. His sister wife, Isis, recovers 13 of the 14, the 14th being his phallus, which is represented by the obelisks, which you see in Egypt. Ironically, you also see them all over Christian America in cemeteries as markers. They gained in popularity as archaeologists in the 19th century began discovering these things or rediscovering them in Egypt. Anyway, in the obelisk, you've got the member of Osiris. In the Capitol Dome, you've got the womb of Isis. And as Tom argued, and I think very eloquently in those books, it's believed by these secret society adepts that at some point the generative power from the obelisk will enter the dome, and as some future character inside the United States Capitol will be empowered to become Apollyon. Hence the title of the first book, Apollyon Rising, 2012. Apollyon, the leader, the king of those in the abyss, those entities in the abyss, who Tom argued was Apollo, the Greek plague god with solar characteristics. He equated Osiris with Apollo. And that's where I differ with Tom. I think he's right in the symbolism of the obelisk and the dome. But as I researched this god, Saturn, who was also known as Kronos to the Greeks, Baal-Hamon to the Phoenicians, El to the Canaanites, Dagon to the Amorites, Enlil to the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and Kumarbi to the Hurrians and Hittites. Very old entity. I argue in the book, and the reason I was tracing this character is because I believe that he is the Watcher Chief Shemiyaza, who led that rebellion as the head of the sons of God of Genesis chapter 6. And then was condemned to the underworld. And I reached that conclusion by noting that as I stumbled across this god in research for previous books, all of his personalities, his identities, were connected to the underworld one way or another, either overtly, like Kumarbi and Kronos and Saturn, as they've been banished to the netherworld, to Tartarus, or sort of hinted at in the cases of like El and Enlil, where the underworld connection is not as overt, but it's definitely there when you start digging into the research. Dagon, for example, his main epithet among the Amorites along the Euphrates River was Lord of the Corpse. I mean, you can't get, So anyway, that's what led me to that. And I thought, okay, so if he's in the underworld, wouldn't it make sense for him to be the king over those in the abyss? I mean, he was the chief of the Watchers who sinned. And according to Peter and Jude, these sinning angels are now in chains in gloomy darkness, which is how Tartarus is described in the Greek stories. Wouldn't that be Saturn instead of Apollo? Especially because there's evidence in the Bible and elsewhere that Apollo was still out roaming around the earth. And that led to the U.S. Capitol. And as I started reading about that, just okay, well, if Saturn's the one who comes out, then it's not Apollo. Maybe I should do something on the Capitol. And Sharon said, "Here, read this chapter I wrote for Tom." And then the art and the architecture began to make more sense. Now, you mentioned the Apotheosis of Washington, which is for some reason, even though I'm fairly well read and enjoy history, I was not even aware until Tom Horn's book in 2012 that the Apotheosis of Washington even existed. I had no idea that there was this painting on the inside of the Capitol dome that depicted George Washington as a god. And it would be easy to hear about that and think, okay, so all of the founding fathers, and there are some well-meaning Christians who've taken that approach, just rejected the opposite side of the spectrum here, guys like David Barton, who believe that all of the founding fathers were God-fearing Christian men, and just go in the other direction, say they were all members of secret societies working for the occult. Somewhere in the middle is the truth. And this idea that Washington, I couldn't wrap my head around it. What little I read about George Washington and his involvement in the settlement of the Ohio River Valley, for example, after the colonial period. Okay, he did some things that were kind of devious. I mean, he owned a lot of property on the frontier. So by giving free land to Revolutionary War veterans, which is a nice thing for the Revolutionary War veterans, but it also created an armed buffer against the natives who weren't happy that the white men were coming in, which made his land more valuable because other people were willing to invest in the properties that he owned. So Washington was the richest man in America in the post-war period. But I still couldn't see him going along with the idea of being elevated to the status of a god inside a national building. And that's when I started digging more into the history of the Capitol and found out that the reason the Capitol is called the Capitol is not because that's what you called your legislative building. In 1799, when L'Enfant was laying out the streets of Washington, D.C. in those interesting Freemasonic patterns, he just wanted to call the Capitol Congress House. It was Jefferson who wanted to call it the Capitol because that was the name of the temple of Jupiter in Rome, the Capitolium. Like,
All right.
Oh, okay. Which then I found out, and here was the connection, that it was put on top of the hill by the last king, the Capitoline Hill, which is where it got its name, by the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, the Tarquin the Proud.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was called the Capitoline Hill because when they were digging the foundations, it was around 510 BC or so, they found a severed head that had been really well preserved, surprisingly. And they took that as a good omen. Hey, this means Rome will be totally awesome. And so because the Latin word for head is caput, they called it the Capitoline Hill. And that's why our capital is called the Capitol, because some guy in Rome 2,500 years ago found a severed head on a hill for a temple devoted to Jupiter, the storm god, who is Zeus, who is Baal, who Jesus in Matthew 12 linked to Satan, identified him as Satan. So, okay. And yes, the name of the hill previous to the discovery of the head was Mons Saturnus, the Mount of Saturn. So, all right, now we're going into a really weird area, Derek, and that's changed the whole direction of my forthcoming book.
Yeah, I mean, and our society, I mean, it sounds weird to say this today because we don't, we've jettisoned so much of classical education, but there was a time when more people were conversant in the classics, which meant that they were conversant in the connections between the classical world and the influence that had on the founding fathers. I mean, and when I say founding fathers, there's kind of two perspectives here. I mean, you can think of the, hundreds of people who were kind of the architects of the American Revolution. And then there's the big seven, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. All of these guys were students of the classics to one degree or another. Some of them more ardently than others. Jefferson probably the most pronounced of all of them because he was, all of them with the exception of Washington, but to his credit, he read a lot of this stuff in translation. He was a voracious reader. Jefferson was proficient in Latin and Greek, and his one of his favorite pastimes was to read the Iliad and the Odyssey in the original Greek. So that ought to tell you, what kind of conversancy these people, and they're always making classical allusions left and right. I mean, you look at their correspondence and their speeches and the documents that they wrote, the books they produced, the pamphlets they produced, it's all over the place. And, I suggested, not just for its alliterative value, but I suggested including Cincinnatus in our title today because that was a very potent symbol in colonial America in the early Republic. Because for folks who don't know, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus was more than likely was a historical figure. There's some debate over whether he may not have been a number of people, but the Livy gives us the kind of that is Titus Livius, the historian. Livy gives us the kind of archetype for Cincinnatus in the volumes we have of the history of early Rome. And he tells us about this guy who was a patrician. He was one of the elites. He lived in the either the late monarchical period or the very early Republic era. And he was a farmer. He owned an estate by profession, but he was also an officer. He was a general in the army. And he was looked upon with such favor by the Roman state that they gave him a temporary title in a time of emergency so that he could take control of not only the entire military, but the entire Roman state and protect it. with the expectation that once the emergency had passed, he would hand the title back over and go back to his farming. Consequently, this title that was given to him was dictator, which has a nefarious connotation as we use it today, but it was an honorable term. The last person to use it in the Republic era was Julius Caesar, but of course he didn't want to give up all the power that came along with being the protector of Rome, so to speak. But Cincinnatus embodied this kind of high moral character and humility, and the ability to accept power for a time and then hand it back over or pass the torch along, as the case may be. And people with all kinds of political aspirations in the early republic kind of viewed themselves as Cincinnatus, but there were some that stood out more than others. Jefferson to an extent, but certainly Washington. He's probably most often compared to Cincinnatus. But the reason I suggested that is because of this reputation that Washington garnered as the American Cincinnatus, because he, of course, became the leader of the Continental Army in 1775, and all he wanted to do, really, even after the war was over, to just go back to Mount Vernon and be the gentleman farmer, that he had been. But the problems of his day kept calling him away, and so that from the time he was actually a very young man when he was an officer in the militia, much of his adult life was spent dealing with other people's problems and problems of a national scale. But in his heart, that's what he always wanted to go back and do, was just to be, George Washington, the farmer. And so perhaps well-deserved that reputation as the American Cincinnatus has been part of the Washingtonian legacy. Yeah.
He was one of the original members of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was founded by Henry Knox in 1783. That's right. So prior to the end of the American Revolution, some of the other notable members include Louis XVI, King of France, Comte de Rochambeau. Who else we got here? Captain Joshua Barney of the U.S. Navy, Commodore John Barry of the Navy. A whole number of Aaron Burr was in there, which is interesting. But it was intended. Henry Dearborn. There's a name I recognize too, being from Chicago. Fort Dearborn being one of the important sites later in the War of 1812. But it was an interesting group, and there's the personal connection to Cincinnatus and Cincinnati is that some of my ancestors were on the first boatload that landed at a site that they originally called Columbia, down below what is now the Cincinnati Airport, Lincoln Field, and there's a memorial stone down there that I've never seen, but my ancestor Groombright Bailey and two of his sons are on that stone. One of whom died because, again, the natives were not really happy that the white man was encroaching that far west along the Ohio River. But this picture of Washington then as one who just wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and live out his days there. And in fact, it was in his will that he wanted to be buried at Mount Vernon. And interestingly, when the Capitol was being designed, and this little argument went back and forth between the architect, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, and Thomas Jefferson over what to call Congress House. And, of course, Jefferson won, which is why it's now the Capitol and why most of our state legislative bodies meet in capitols. They had planned on the ground floor, which is called the crypt, even though there's nobody buried there. It's just the ground floor below the level below the rotunda in the Capitol. In one of the chambers off of the crypt, they had planned to entomb George Washington. And in fact, Martha had given her permission to do this. Now, and again, this is something that Tom wrote about in Apollyon Rising and Zenith 2016. But as I was looking at the description, again, of the Apotheosis of Washington, which depicts him amongst the gods with the goddess Liberty sitting to his right, wearing a Phrygian cap, interestingly. And this depiction then of various scenes of idyllic American life, and bearing in mind the Capitol was not completed, or the dome and the painting was not done until 1865. But I wondered if this was named the Capitol, derived from the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, why doesn't it look like the Temple of Jupiter in Rome? Because there's no dome, as far as any historical evidence. There was no dome on the Temple of Jupiter. So where did that come from? And that's when I, again, doing a little digging into the history of the Capitol, it was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. And we Americans, or at least I thought, the Pantheon was, well, it's just what you call the collection of gods of any particular group of people. Yeah, but in Rome, the Pantheon was the temple that was to all of them, and it had this really big dome on top of it, which, considering that it was built 2,000 years ago when they didn't have rebar, it's a concrete dome. And the fact that it's stood for 2,000 years is really remarkable. The architect Marcus Agrippa still has his name in big letters across the front of the building. It's well deserved. But there was a hole. There's an opening in the top of the dome called the oculus, which is Latin for eye. And those who've researched it found that Agrippa, when he designed the building as a friend of Octavian, Caesar Augustus, wanted to put a statue of Caesar Augustus inside the Pantheon, and the oculus then to depict his ascension into the heavens, his apotheosis to become as a god.
Yeah, the deification of his genius, and hence the emperor cult.
Right. Now, Octavian was smart enough to realize that there was still a lot of royalty or anti-imperial sentiment among the patrician class in Rome. So he was very careful to depict himself only as the first among equals, the first citizen or whatever. But Agrippa did get him to agree to put the statue of Julius, his uncle Julius, or adopted uncle Julius, inside. So it depicted the apotheosis of Julius Caesar and his ascension to godhood. But that's what inspired the oculus inside the United States Capitol. Now, there was a hole in the floor originally of the rotunda, a 10-foot diameter hole that was directly above this chamber where Washington's body was supposed to lay. So essentially, they were opening a space below to allow his spirit to rise from the netherworld, as it were, to the heavens, hence the depiction of Washington as a god on the inside of the dome, viewed through the oculus, just like the Pantheon in Rome. Now, again, Martha had given her permission, but construction delays and the War of 1812 got in the middle. Then the Brits set everything back by burning the Capitol. And by the time they finally got around to, it, Washington's descendants said, no, we're just going to respect his wishes. He's going to remain here at Mount Vernon. So Washington's body never did occupy that space that was reserved for him. But in 1865, we still got Constantino Brumidi and the apotheosis there. And as Tom Horn pointed out in his books, the 72 stars around it, there's that number again, representing what he called a Freemasonic binding utility. Those represents the 70 or the 72 sons of God placed over the nations after Babel. That's described in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. When God divided the nations, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. And that number represents all of them, the complete set. So all of the gods of the nations, except for Israel, which belongs to God, that's what's represented on the circle around the outside of the Apotheosis of Washington. And there's Washington sitting in the middle like he's presiding over the whole thing. And the thing that struck me, again, as I'm trying to process all of this, and, okay, how does this relate to what Tom wrote previously? I think there's a better connection identifying Osiris as Saturn, who was bound in the underworld. And then in reading about the Temple of Saturn in Rome, which had sort of been booted off the top of that hill to make room for the Temple of Jupiter, the statue of Saturn was always shown with his legs wrapped. The statue, the legs were wrapped in wool, which depicted, I guess, represented his binding in Tartarus by Jupiter, except during the Saturnalia, that period from December 17th through the 22nd or whatever. Yeah. So
23rd. Uh-huh.
Okay. So you got Washington on in this painting up there with this purple cloth, and purple, of course, the color representing royalty. But his legs, when you look at it, his legs are completely covered. His legs are bound, just like Saturn in the underworld. Mm-hmm. So, again, the danger, as you pointed out, is that it's easy for us to step back and say, the whole founding of the country is, well, maybe not systemically racist, but systemically pagan, and throw everything out. But Washington, as you say, would probably have, he had a pretty fiery temper, although he kept it in check most of the time, but he might have let fly when he saw these plans. That and that statue, which, as far as I know, it's not on display anywhere, the statue of Washington wearing a robe depicted like he's Jupiter. I mean... Yeah.
He undoubtedly would have. And I always told my students, because I taught both sections of American history for 20 years. I always told my students, look, you have to, to study history, to be a good historian, you have to take people as they were. You have to take the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I would, because I'm not saying that I'm not a Washington apologist here. He had character defects just like everybody else did. I do think it's interesting that, in the case of slavery, whereas Jefferson could articulate the rights of all men, he never freed any of his slaves during the course of his lifetime, and Washington did. And so he would do it rather cleverly, particularly when, he was at the headquarters up north. He would bring in families of slaves from Mount Vernon and just casually not, go back and not take them with him. Now, he didn't do that with all of his slaves, but he put into action a lot of the things that Jefferson wrote about and never did. And I suspect that has to do with the fact that while Jefferson and, valuable though their contributions were ideologically and philosophically, while people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry were in Williamsburg attending balls, Washington was out on the Ohio frontier dodging musket balls. And, he had a completely different experience because he served alongside people of African descent during the French and Indian War, and saw that they're, for his own eyes, that they were every bit as capable as people of any skin tone, were every bit as brave, every bit as intelligent. And there's an instance where Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem to Washington. It was an African American poetess, and she presented it to him, and he and Martha invited her to the headquarters there in New York. For people of the Washington stature, this was unheard of in that day. For any person of African descent, free or otherwise, which she was free. But you really have to pay attention, and not just take the sort of generic version of Washington that we get. If you really want to understand Washington, and a lot of the criticism, that I hear towards Washington, has to do with his involvement in Freemasonry. He was a master mason. Well, that's the third degree. That's not even a high-ranking Mason, and we only have documentary evidence that he attended 4 meetings in the course of his lifetime. how could he be part of a Freemasonic conspiracy when he was busy fighting in the French and Indian War, first of all, trying to dig his own farm out of debt, when he got back home from that. Then he serves as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Then he's part of the early Republic government. He's elected president. When did the man have time?
Mm-hmm. That's
what I'm saying. He spent most of his adult life dealing with other people's problems and the problems of his nation. There are numerous testimonies of his devout faith. We have his prayer book preserved to us. His church attendance is attested to. I hear a lot of the critics that say he was an Illuminized Freemason or whatever say that he didn't take communion every time at church. And I think in order to understand this is that Washington, again, this goes back to his character. You have to understand that Washington was so severe in the execution of his morality, which was informed by his Christianity, that he took Paul's admonition to heart about examining yourself before taking communion. And I think he was that kind of man that if he felt that there was something between him and God that needed to be resolved at that moment, then he wouldn't take it. That speaks more, in my mind, to his testimony as a believer than lots of things. And when you as the founding fathers would have said, you cannot but help see the hand of providence, the God of the universe, in his life, because of all the engagements he was in the French and Indian War, he was never shot. His trench coat was filled with musket ball holes, and the natives, the Iroquois and Algonquin-speaking tribes, thought that this was big medicine, and it enhanced, his reputation amongst the Indians of the Northeast and the Ohio River Valley, and certainly garnered him a reputation back home. And to think of all the hardships that he went through, having dysentery, a number of times, and still having to travel, and lead columns of troops to battle, to camp. The fact that Washington, when Lexington and Concord were attacked, one of the first things he did after he met Adams was he said, "Look, I'll raise an army of 1,000 men and outfit them at my own expense and march them there if I have to." You take all these things as a whole, and what you have is a man. You do kind of have an American Cincinnatus. You have a man who has a deep sense of duty, and who believes that God is calling him to take an active leadership role in the founding of this country, in which God's principles, biblical principles, the gospel of Jesus Christ, can be expounded and applied and lived, both in civilian life and in government life. And so, I think it's, again, you can talk about Franklin and the Hellfire Club and the libertinism that did exist in certain quarters amongst the founding fathers. But I don't think that you can vilify Washington with those kinds of accusations, because they just don't stand up. You just don't get that kind of a picture. Again, when you critically and more closely look at Washington, when you look at his writings, when you look at accounts of Washington's behavior.
So how do we get from this picture of George Washington as a man who relinquished command as soon as he was able, once he stepped down from the presidency, could have been acclaimed king if he had wanted it? He could have grabbed that power for himself like Julius Caesar did, to today, where we've got this as you call it, civil religion, where we got some of the highest-ranking elected officials in the country, like Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, many other members of Congress, political commentators on cable news all over the country, calling the United States Capitol, again, named for the Temple of Jupiter, our temple of democracy, and that it was desecrated by these insurrectionists. And even, again, Liz Cheney referring to it as the most sacred space in our democracy. How do we get here, and why is it being presented to us as this somehow sacred, inviolable space, and those who transgressed inside those hallowed walls should suffer banishment from society? I mean, reports coming out of Washington are some of these guys are being held in solitary confinement, including the Buffalo Hat guy. What is the purpose of this civil religion?
Well, I think this is the dark underbelly of that's so-called civil religion, as Robert Bella and others have described it. I suspect that amongst their number are these, Illuminized individuals, whatever cabal or society they happen to belong to. They recognize the traditions, that go back to people like L'Enfant, and what exactly it was that the Illuminized Freemasons were trying to do. And as a footnote to that, I don't want to backtrack too much, but I should say that Washington himself warned us about the Illuminati. There's an interesting series of letters that people can go look up in the National Archives. There was a minister by the name of G.W. Snyder who sent Washington a letter talking about Adam Weishaupt's book on the Bavarian Illuminati, and that Snyder suspected that from his own work believed that they were in the country and was trying to get Washington to take a closer look at it. And Washington fires back in 1798 with this response and basically says, I appreciate your letter, blah, blah, blah. And that basically, I have no doubt that the Illuminati and the Jacobins are here, essentially saying that because I've had to deal with them already. Now, that's interesting that he mentions the Jacobins and the Illuminati in the same sentence, because the Jacobins were the Illuminati in Europe that had fomented the French Revolution. And under the auspices of crackpots like Ambassador Genet, who came over and tried to recruit amongst the Americans for the French Revolution. There's a great scene in the John Adams miniseries where Jefferson is sort of watching this argument between Washington and Genet, and with a few word changes, it's pretty close to what actually happened. And you can tell that Jefferson's getting a little nervous because he had sympathized with a lot of these people while he was the ambassador in France. And when Washington kicks Genet out, who was himself a Jacobin, he looks over at Jefferson and says, "Mr. Jefferson, Ambassador Genet has taken leave of his senses." So Washington had been dealing with these crazy guys that were part of the Bavarian Illuminati for years because they've been trying to recruit in the early Republic for people to go fight in France. And I suspect that Washington would have been more apt to reciprocate the help that France had given us had the Jacobins not been so involved in orchestrating the French Revolution. So he was clearly he names them by name. He calls them out by name, the Illuminati. So he not only knew that, but a couple of years before that, in his farewell speech after he steps down from the presidency, he warns about all kinds of foreign entanglements and getting involved, the young republic getting involved in these foreign entanglements, not just for that sake, because, war is costly and the fledgling economy was on shaky ground to begin with. But so many of them in the old world were being fomented by these Illuminized Freemasons and other secret societies. That's not hyperbole or fiction. It's attested to in documents. He also says, guard against partisanship, because he had already seen the effect that the Illuminati had on the developing political parties in the United States, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And so he warned against this kind of dissension, unhealthy dissension in the halls of government, and certainly against these foreign influences, which more often than not included this Illuminati, impact that he was so in such trepidation about as the first president. So he, that letter just blew my mind the first time that I saw it. I mean, this doesn't seem like deflection or smoke and mirrors on Washington's part. I think he's sincerely warning not only Snyder, but by proxy, he's warning the nation about what's going on.
And yet it seems that those who were sympathetic to the Jacobins and by extension the Illuminati have retained control or managed to obtain control and hold on to control here in the United States, as evidenced by this hue and cry after what happened on January 6th, this desecration of their temple, of the temple to democracy. It's the first time I've ever heard that phrase used, and it was repeated so often that it's like, okay, this came out as talking points, because this is being repeated across the aisle. It's being repeated by various, on various cable networks by these political talking heads. Where did we ever get this idea that America, we're supposed to be a nation that is under God, but God is not worshipped in a temple devoted to government business? I mean, as I read the New Testament, when Satan tempted Jesus in the desert, he said, all of these kingdoms have been given to me, and I give them to whom I will. If you just bow the knee to me, you can have this kingdom. And would not all kingdoms of the earth be included in that? Why would we Americans and American Christians think that we somehow are exempt from that? That's not to say that everyone who's in government service is a loyal lieutenant of Satan. That's not the case at all. I know some good men and women who are, God-believing, God-fearing, blood-bought Christians who are in government service. But I would say that they're behind enemy lines. And it is certainly enemy territory. And I think it's telling. And I remembered as you were talking about this, that Sharon spotted this as we were talking on PID Radio back in 2007, the speech that Nancy Pelosi gave when she was elected Speaker for the first time for the 110th Congress. I remember because we cleverly titled that episode Pelosium 110 instead of Polonium 210. And she said, and I quote, "Our founders envisioned a new America driven by optimism, opportunity, and courage. So confident were they in the new America they were advancing, they put on the Great Seal of the United States, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages." And this is a reference, of course, to the obverse, or the reverse, rather, of the Great Seal, which 33rd degree Freemason Franklin Delano Roosevelt put on the left-hand side of the reverse of the dollar bill rather than on the right, even though the reverse of the Great Seal, that's the unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye, has never been used to seal any government document. But because he put it on the left, people looking at the dollar bill think, okay, that must be the important part, and the thing with the eagle on the right, which is the actual Great Seal that's used to seal official government documents, that's sort of the less important part. Because the illumined adepts saw in that a representation of, and credit to Tom Horn for pointing this out in his books, a representation of America. And America, when it emerged to its status as a global leader, the missing capstone would finally be fitted on that pyramid and we would then enter this new order. And that's where we come back to Saturn, because that line comes from Virgil's fourth eclogue, which cites the Cumaean Sibyl, whose role in the origin story of Rome is critical. She provided the scrolls that Tarquin the Proud purchased. Originally, there were 9, and he didn't believe that they were real, so she burned 3 and said, "I'll sell you 6 for the same price as the 9." And he said, "Now," so finally, his oracles and advisors said, after she'd burned 6 of the 9, you better get these last 3, which then were locked up in the temple of Jupiter and consulted by the Senate whenever there was a bad omen in the sky or whatever. Anyway, because the Roman poet Virgil cited the Cumaean Sibyl in this Eclogue 4, it was taken as a prophecy, and a prophecy of the return. See, justice returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. That's the money quote right there from the poem. Pelosi cited that during her speech when she became the Speaker of the House for the first time 14 years ago, saying this vision has sustained us for more than 200 years, and it accounts for what is best in our great nation: liberty, opportunity, and justice. Well, we've seen what justice means here in 2020 and 2021. It doesn't mean equal opportunity. It means equal outcomes. Liberty, as opposed to freedom. I think liberty, what they mean liberty is liberty as in libertine, like Franklin's Hellfire.
Exactly.
Franklin's Hellfire Club, as we look at the culture around us. So this is taken as a prophecy of a new age where Saturn returns and reclaims his throne from Jupiter. Saturn moves his temple from the base of the Capitoline Hill and returns to his rightful place in the heavens at the top of the Capitol. That's where I suggest an alternate interpretation to the art and architecture of the Capitol from what Tom Horn offered. But more than that, and again, credit to Sharon for pointing this out, on December 21st of last year, we had the Great Conjunction in the sky, what the media was all too happy to call the Christmas star, where Jupiter and Saturn met in the sky on the winter solstice, another very important date. What's important about that date to astrologers and occultists was that it took place at 0 degrees of the constellation Aquarius, which means we have fully moved into the age of Aquarius now. And Aquarius, according to astrologers, is ruled by Saturn. So we have finally moved into the new golden age, a return of old Saturn's reign, which apparently is depicted on the dome of the United States Capitol. Did Constantino Brumini know what he was writing about? I don't know what Brumini's affiliations were. I don't know if he was a Freemason or member of the Rosicrucians of the Golden Dawn. I don't know. I've not done enough history on Brumini to know. All I know is that we've got this depiction inside the dome, and then just 2 weeks later, this temple of our democracy is desecrated by this group on Epiphany, the day when the deity of Jesus is revealed to the earth, the day when Christians celebrate that event, in a temple named for the temple of the chief god of Rome and Greece, the storm god identified by Jesus as Satan, and apparently celebrating now this Epiphany, or this revelation, this theophany. That was the word I was looking for before. The Eastern Church calls it theophany. This theophany, welcoming the return of Saturn, in other words, Shemiyaza, the leader of the Watchers, who, according to the book of Revelation, Revelation 9, when the abyss opens up, Apollyon is who comes out. And I agree with Tom that character who comes out is Apollyon, but does it mean this is actually going to literally happen in the Capitol? No, I don't think so. I mean, look around the world. Every single mosque that Sharon and I saw when we were going through Israel and Jordan, there's an obelisk and a dome.
Obelisk and a dome.
Why do the Muslims do this? I think this is a symbol that the spirit realm's just been kind of whispering in the ears of those who are listening to voices other than that coming from God. Did Jefferson really know what he was doing when he insisted on calling the House of our legislature, the Capitol. No, I just think he wanted to evoke this image of Republican Rome, the Roman Republic. He wanted to, this is the grand experiment that the Romans had for, 400 years before it began to fall apart. I think that's what he was trying to evoke, but it's been turned into a civil religion, and the occult adepts and the Illuminists and the Freemasons have embedded into the art and the architecture there, not just all throughout Washington, D.C., but especially inside the United States Capitol and the National Mall, the symbolism that of what they hope to accomplish. They want to bring this old entity back out of the underworld to bring back a new golden age, and they think. Yeah, and if you. They think it began on December 21st, which is why I think there's this push for the Great Reset by the World Economic Forum. I think that there are many wealthy, powerful people out there who, oddly enough, really do believe that our destinies are controlled by the movements of the planets in the heavens.
Well, that's the 21st. You're right smack dab in the middle of the Saturnalia, according to the old Roman calendar.
yeah, there's that too.
Well, I mean, if you're going to anthropomorphize the gods of the Aquarian age, the new or returning gods, let's say, what better way to embed that into the public consciousness, or even, let's just say the public unconsciousness? What better way to do that than to, deify the founding fathers, deify the people that spilt their lifeblood, applied their talents, not perfect people by any stretch of the imagination. But if we learn anything from the Scripture, God uses imperfect people all the time to do His perfect will, whether they are on board with His plan or not. But yeah, I really think that the people that generation that followed the founders, at the end of the early republic, into the 19th century, they were the ones that were responsible for the American pantheon, and not the founders themselves. But we still have, like Bella and others have pointed out, we still live with the legacy of that civil religion, that public religion that they created, which is also consequently a nod to ancient Rome, because the public sphere of religion in ancient Rome was almost inseparable from the political life of Rome.
Sure, it was.
The Roman politics and religion rode in the same cart. It was not uncommon, like you say. I mean, there were all kinds of mystical texts that were kept in the Senate. That were kept in all manner of civil buildings in Rome, in case augurs needed to be consulted, in case omens needed to be read. You had to call on the Flamini and the various colleges of pontiffs, the priests, because it was all tied in with sacred space and sacred time. I mean, there's not a day in the Roman calendar that doesn't have some festival or rite that's connected with the function of the Roman state.
Mm-hmm.
And to some degree, that's preserved in this American civil religion.
And the pantheon includes, and it's changing a little bit in the last few years. Washington, of course, is one you could never say anything bad about. And it was almost like some of the stories about Washington, chopping down the cherry tree and throwing the silver dollar across the Potomac were like the saints' lives, the medieval saints' lives, where
right.
the stories were just, more spectacular than anything in the New Testament. But now there are other figures who we dare not blaspheme. such as Abraham Lincoln, I would argue Dr. Martin Luther King, and some others who we dare not say anything about, because that the reaction against any word spoken ill about certain characters is more intense than against those who take the name of the Lord in vain or blaspheme against Jesus Christ, who speak blasphemy in our churches. The insidious nature of the civil religion, and this is why I was alarmed when I first heard Tom Horn talk about dominionism. This was back in 2006. He was on Steve Quayle's program, and I'd never heard of dominionism either. I'd lived kind of a sheltered theological life until the last 15, 20 years. And I've given a number of public presentations on dominion theology, which I think is a real snare to conservative Bible-believing Christians, because we tend to be among the most patriotic of Americans. And we sort of conflate this civil religion with following our service to our Lord. We conflate God and country into one thing, forgetting that our country, our citizenship is first and foremost in His kingdom. We are citizens of a theocracy, first and foremost. So what do we do as Christians then, Judd, to separate out our duty as Christians to make disciples of all nations according to Jesus, and our patriotic tendencies to want to put America first?
Mm-hmm. I think honoring our kingdom duty only reinforces our patriotism, or it should, even if that patriotism is in direct opposition to a steadily corrupted government. Which I think it's safe to say that we've reached that point. Where our patricians on the Hill can't identify for the most part, with us lowly plebeians.
Right.
And that's a precarious position, but in thinking about people like Washington, he saw it as his patriotic duty to have his actions guided by his faith, and they led him to, oppose the British government, which had, for hundreds of years by that point been the ruling authority over the colonies. I'll say hundreds of years.
About 160 years by that point.
1607. Yeah, 1607. If you take it back to other English settlements, you could say late 1500s. But the point that I'm making is that his faith informed his patriotism, even if it was against the prevailing wisdom of the ruling authority. When that ruling authority stands in opposition to the principles of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, so be it. If the history of our nation has proven anything, it's that righteous indignation and the dissent based on said righteous indignation is patriotic.
And I think we need to, again, just be very careful that we don't confuse opposition to specific political party with duty to our Lord and Savior. And there have been some who have made that, who have confused those issues, made that a test of faith, a test of orthodoxy.
Well, and we're back at square one with Washington's warning, in his farewell address about the dangers of partisanship.
Right.
Even with the arguments over, what direction the Constitution was supposed to take, he could see the vehemence, and I'm sure in Washington's mind, at times he must have thought that God had grown quite weary of being called down on both sides of an argument, which, is no less true today than it was back then.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a fascinating issue when you look at how and we should not be surprised as a nation that was founded by people who were looking for a place to practice their religion without the oversight and intrusion by the head of the Church of England, for the enemy to basically infiltrate and try to redirect the nation. And certainly there are things that have been done by the government of this nation in our name that are ungodly, to say the least. But that does not prevent us from trying to live up to the ideal of those original pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. And sometimes that will mean standing up to the ruling authorities in Washington, D.C. But first and foremost, that needs to be done in service of fulfilling the Great Commission that Jesus gave us, which
Absolutely.
is to share the hope that we have in Jesus Christ with a world that is growing ever darker. And as long as, as we're recording this week, we've had 2 days in a row now where the spokesperson for the White House has literally said that there are folks inside the White House who are flagging social media posts for social media companies to take down what they call misinformation. Now, misinformation is in the eye of the beholder, of course, but they're wanting social media companies to start cracking down on information. In this, to begin with now, it's about vaccines. But as with everything government does, the mission will creep and it will extend into other areas. So we as Christians need to understand that let's not take our eyes off the ball and say, look, let's get angry and worked up about the vaccines. Easy enough to do. I'm right there with you on that. But while we still have the opportunity to share the hope that we have, the love that Christ showed even those who put him on the cross, forgiving them for they knew not what they did. We need to take advantage of this opportunity. And if they kick us off social media, then we just have to go back to the first century model and talk to people face to face.
That's right. That's right. Which we should be doing anyway.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, brother, what's going on with the Institute of Biblical Anthropology?
Oh man, I'm probably busier than I need to be. I'm picking up a lot of new students. I've got 6 programs now. Biblical anthropology, biblical demonology, preternatural morphology, which is a hot one right now. That's the Monsters 101
sweet
class. And then I've got a new ancient Near Eastern civilization program. There's a Mediterranean one. And then I have a new mythology certification as well. And those are all on sale. They'll continue to be on sale when this is aired for $150 each. I've got rudiments of New Testament Greek that I'm offering as well. I've got 3 Greek students. I've got 1 article and 2 books that I'm finishing right now, and things are starting to pick up quite a bit, particularly on the teaching side. And I've got just some stellar students. I mean, just fantastic.
Well, that's it. People who are interested in this subject, I mean, this is the kind of thing that really gets students fired up. And so if they're searching you out and digging into this material, I can understand why.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's ancient, but it's timely. It's timeless. And I don't think there's ever been a time for students of the Bible to be more familiar with this kind of material, because as I'm fond of saying, context is theology, and you're going to get a lot of that at the Institute.
Yeah. The Institute of Biblical Anthropology, Judd is your instructor, and the website is tioba.org. There'll be a link in the show notes at vftb.net or wherever else you're checking out this podcast tonight. Judd, look forward to that book on Göbekli Tepe. Your presentation on Göbekli Tepe and the Watcher's influence there was, for the Defender Conference Rise 2021, was fascinating.
Yeah, well, the presentations I've seen so far are just incredible. I've enjoyed all of them. I'm looking forward to the day when we can all meet in person again.
Yeah, hopefully sooner rather than later. I mean, TSA says the mask mandate on planes will end September 15th, so we're praying that they hold to that and don't say, oh, sorry, we've seen an uptick of cases, so you're going to have to stick that face diaper back on. It's like, all right, we're just going to drive. All right. Dr. Judd Burton, burtonbeyond.com and TIOBA.org. Judd, thanks for the topic and the title tonight. And we look forward to talking with you again soon and seeing you soon, too, when you're come up here to do some programs on your book. Absolutely. Thanks, Derek. Dr. Judd Burton online, burtonbeyond.com or TIOBA.org. And you can also follow him on Twitter. That's the social media site, at Burton Beyond on Twitter. Coming up, a couple of thoughts on some interesting pronouncements from the White House this past week as they want to make it more difficult for us to, really exercise our First Amendment rights. That and some conference news straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues.
Call now and get Reverend Donna Howell and Special Investigator Allie Hinson's brand new eye-opening book, Dark Covenant, along with a never-before-released 4-part Dark Covenant companion DVD, and Occultianity, How the End Times Church is Forming Now in Preparation of Antichrist on DVD. This is an exclusive offer for our SkyWatch television audience. Yours for a donation of $35 plus shipping and handling. In the new book, Dark Covenant, you will learn how the church is being groomed to embrace the unthinkable in preparation for the enforcement of the mark of the beast, how the true body of Christ is being slowly positioned to be considered a public enemy, with the Bible labeled as hate speech and possibly soon prohibited, why much of the church has been lulled into slumber over the preceding decades and is unprepared to be a force for good in our troubled world, how much of Western Christianity has actually become a cult, and what the true body of Christ can do to survive the modern assault on Christianity. You'll also receive the Dark Covenant Companion DVD. Join Reverend Donna Howell, Allie Hinson, and the Skywatch investigative team for this original 4-part series on DVD. This eye-opening expose is already sending shockwaves through the Western religious establishment and is certain to help ready the true remnant of God with the tools needed to navigate the coming days of persecution. But that's not all. In this must-have collection, you'll also receive Occultianity, How the End Times Church is Forming Now in Preparation of Antichrist. In this exclusive never-before-released DVD, Donna Howell and Allie Hinson walk you step-by-step through the well-laid plans of an occult oligarchy who are, as we speak, advancing the way for the system of Antichrist, all while a silent, complacent church has forgotten the true power of the body of Christ and are inadvertently laying the foundation for the bloodiest cult the world has ever seen. This DVD alone is a last day's warning that all true believers must have that will equip God's anointed with the knowledge and power they need to set people free from the powers of deception. Sold separately, these items hold a retail value of more than $75. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling while supplies last. Prepare for the coming days of religious fallout as a ready soldier for the coming true Messiah. The Dark Covenant special offer, available now at SkyWatchTVstore.com. Order now or call 1-844-750-4985.
Driving the internet to think. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online, VFTB.net. That is our global hub, if you will. You'll also find us on social media, Twitter at View from Bunker, or my personal Twitter handle, which is at Derek Gilbert. On Facebook, the page View from the Bunker. You also find me on Gab and MeWe, and now Getter, Gettr. That's the new social media site formed by a former member of Donald Trump's team, Justin, is it Justin Miller? Oh, gosh, I should know. Anyway, Gettr, and my handle there, at Derek P. Gilbert. The interface very much like Twitter. Some are saying it he essentially ripped off the user interface. Whatever. It's not Twitter, and that is a good thing. Because social media, in general, Facebook in particular, is being weaponized by the progressives in these United States. This week we had not once, but twice, and the first time that Jen Psaki, Circleback Psaki, said this on Thursday, I thought maybe she misspoke, just accidentally said the quiet part out loud. But she doubled down on this at the press conference on Friday. On Thursday, she said literally that there's a team inside the Surgeon General's office that's flagging posts on Facebook for misinformation for Facebook to remove. Think about that. A team inside the White House that is flagging for social media, Facebook, posts spreading misinformation that should be removed, according to the White House. Now, again, I'm thinking, okay, she's just expressing an opinion here. Did she misspeak? Did she overstep? Didn't sound that way when I watched the video clip. But then Friday, she repeated it and said, there are like 12 people out there on Facebook who are spreading about 65% of this misinformation about COVID vaccines. Now, wait a minute. 12 people, 65% of the information. How do they get those numbers? Are they literally tracking this? Do they have lists of people who are naughty and others who are nice? How did they compile those numbers? Are they tracking people and what they say on social media? Now, this shouldn't surprise us. Years ago, one of the first conferences I spoke at, this was the 2012 Science and the Supernatural conference. It was in Chicago, organized by Russ Dizdar and Tom Dunn. And I gave a presentation on the intelligence community's involvement very early in the development of Facebook, because some of the earliest investors were tightly connected to the intelligence community. Now, it was not, what is the venture capital arm of the CIA? In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel did not directly invest in Facebook, but there were others who were strongly associated with the intelligence community and investing in technologies that would benefit the intelligence community, who did invest early on in Facebook. And it's pretty clear as you look at Facebook's dominance of the social media field and its desire to not just facilitate sharing thoughts and ideas with friends and family members around the world, but to be involved in every aspect of our lives. Buying online, buying and selling. Do you have a local community now that uses Facebook as sort of a virtual garage sale or flea market? We do. Sharon and I use it quite a bit, and frankly, they want to be sort of like China's Weibo, where you can buy things and sell things, use them to handle all of your transactions. Facebook wants that for the rest of the world. But at the same time, they've compelled us, convinced us, lured us into sharing information with the world that we would never have voluntarily given up to somebody if they'd come to the door and said, "Hi, we're from the U.S. Census. Can we go through your family photo albums? What are your political views? Who do you share them with? What meetings do you go to? What clubs do you..." Things that we would never tell the government willingly, we are now openly sharing online through Facebook and other social media sites. Instagram, Pinterest, things like that. It is a wealth of information that the CIA and, frankly, the East German Stasi would have loved to have had back in the day. And now, thanks to technology, we just give it up willingly. And now the White House is saying that they want social media to start clamping down. Now that they've got us all on the platform, they're taking deplatforming a step further. I mean, it's bad enough that social media was doing it as a sort of de facto ministry of truth for the political class in Washington, D.C. Now, the political elites, starting with the White House, are publicly saying, we want Facebook to take down this information. And by extension, one would assume, since they're going after the big dog first, that would also then apply to Twitter and to Instagram, which is, of course, owned by Facebook, and other social media sites where we might exchange information. Telegram, or what's the other, the competitor of Telegram? Signal. They want to basically tell these sites what can and cannot be shared, because misinformation kills when it comes to the vaccines. Okay, if you say so. I'm looking at the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, hosted by the CDC. But now, again, this is voluntary information that's not checked. But the voluntary reports to VAERS shows that since the COVID vaccines were first rolled out last December, there have been over 10,000 reported deaths now. Over 10,000 reported deaths connected to the vaccine. These are not confirmed. because, again, this is a voluntary reporting system. They don't send somebody out to confirm, was there an autopsy? Can we confirm that this was? No, it's somebody sent in a report saying this person took the vaccine. Here are the symptoms. Here's what happened. Okay. But by the same token, those reports at VAERS for previous years were not confirmed either. And when you add up the total number of deaths reported, the total number of reported deaths connected to vaccines for the years 2000 through 2019, all right, that's 20 years for all vaccines combined. The number of reported deaths connected to COVID vaccines for the last 8 months is running roughly, what did I figure out in the math? Something like 230 times higher than it was for the other vaccines. Now, is somebody possibly in there jiggering the numbers? It's possible. Have no way to know. All I'm saying is that the sheer number of reports through this voluntary system should be enough of a red flag for the government to say, wait a minute, hold up. Let's look at this, because if we're seeing this number of deaths, which we've never seen before in this system, for all vaccines combined, much less for one single type of vaccine, let's stop and reevaluate what we're doing here. Because it would logically follow, if we've got this many more reported deaths connected to a vaccine, wouldn't we, over an extended period of time, isn't it logical to at least ask whether we might see a similar increase in other adverse side effects? I know there are friends of mine who, when I start talking this way, say, well, come on, the number of people, even if this number is accurate, it's still way less than the number of people who died from COVID. Okay, yeah. Assuming that those numbers are accurate, because we've all heard and read the stories of the, guy falls off the ladder, dies of COVID. Guy gets shot, dies of COVID. Okay, let's assume the numbers are accurate. But in any previous human trial, we would have had a halt to the trials if we had seen this number of adverse reactions way before we got to this point. And essentially, because these vaccines were released under an emergency use authorization, these are human trials that are taking place right now. But if you dare bring any of this up, they will kick you off social media, because that's misinformation, and misinformation might kill. And now, again, this week, the White House confirming twice, yeah, we have people inside flagging posts we want social media to take down. Glenn Beck, on Friday during his show, put it like this: you see that little speck in your rearview mirror getting smaller and smaller? That's the First Amendment. And it's gone. That's kind of where we're headed as a country right now. But as Christians, our mission is not to take back the country politically. Our mission is to make disciples of all nations. The first century church, they lived under a government that was far more totalitarian than what we've got going here. Let us keep that in mind and keep that in sight. And while we have time, let us continue to share the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, because our view is the long one, eternity, not on the next election cycle. So, a couple of conferences. The SkyWatch TV Defender Virtual Conference, Rise 2021. It launched on June 18th, but it runs through September 18th. So you still have 2 months to access 2 conferences worth of information. Tom Horn's presentation on The Secret Destiny of America covers a lot of the information that Judd and I were discussing tonight. Again, the one difference, and I wouldn't even call it a difference necessarily, I'm just looking at an alternate interpretation on the very end of the story. Is the entity that emerges from the abyss Apollo, or is it Shemiyaza? So you'll see that in my presentation, but Tom's presentation, a 2-hour presentation produced by Josh Peck, is essentially a standalone documentary, and he really goes into a lot of the occult underpinnings that I didn't have time to get into. So do check that out. Joel Richardson, Mark Biltz, Carl Gallups, all New York Times bestselling authors, geopolitical expert like Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, end times prophecy experts like Dr. Ken Johnson, Colonel David Giammona, Troy Anderson, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, Dr. Michael Lake, just some fascinating stuff. And Judd Burton, his presentation on the Watchers in Göbekli Tepe, fascinating. Aaron Judkins on the discovery of the 12th scroll cave at Qumran, fascinating. Dr. Scott Stripling, who heads up the dig at Shiloh, they believe they found the location of the tabernacle. The tabernacle that Moses and the Israelites brought out of Egypt, where it stood for more than 300 years before they moved everything over to, Jerusalem. Yeah, fascinating. Plus, you get all of the best from last year's conference as well. You can get immediate access to the videos and then watch them on your own schedule. Just binge watch. DefenderConference.com is the website to go to. DefenderConference.com. In just a couple of weeks, Sharon and I will be essentially presenting a weekend retreat called Revelation, Insight, and Spiritual Warfare. We'll be talking about the book of Revelation, the divine council concept and how it applies to the Bible, and some talk on spiritual warfare as well. This is the first weekend in August 6th, 7th, and 8th at the Finley River Ranch, which is in Sparta, Missouri, just south of Springfield. The cost is $150. There are sessions on Friday evening, 6:30 to 9, Saturday between 9 and 4:30 with a break for lunch. Lunch is included, by the way. And then Sunday morning, there'll be worship, and then I think what will probably happen is I will preach some. So you can find out more and sign up, but don't wait because it's only a couple of weeks out, first of all, about 3 weeks out, but also because it's a rather small facility, 75 to 100 people at most, I think. So it will be a wonderful gathering and an opportunity for us to meet some new friends. We were there back in March. Alec and Ginny Wade of His Call Ministries, wonderful people. Joy Stevenson, who coordinated it, just absolutely wonderful, treated us better than we deserved. And just a group of people hungry to learn, and we always love being in situations like that. Again, it's His Call Ministries. The website is hiscallministries.net, hiscallministries.net. In September, we'll be back in California for the first time in a couple of years. We were in Orange County with Hear the Watchman the last time. This time, Hear the Watchman moving down to San Diego for the Warriors Conference, September 16th through 18th. We'll be there with Pastor Paul Begley, L.A. Marzulli, Jamie Walden, Colonel David Giammona, David Hevner, Dave Hodges of the Common Sense Show will be there, Joni Stahl, John and Chelsea Jubilee, and wonderful worship music from Lori and Jacob Bango. Find out more and sign up at hearthewatchman.com, and we can save you money. We can save you money by using the promo code Gilbert20, Gilbert20, when you check out at hearthewatchman.com. $20 off on tickets when you use that promo code. And the Skywatch TV tour of Israel. Because of COVID-19 and the probability that Israel will still be requiring a vaccine to get into the country in October, we've moved the October tour to next spring, March 20th through April 4th. The new dates for Skywatch TV's tour of Israel. There's an optional 3-day extension over to Jordan, and we hope you join us. It'll be Sharon, me, our colleagues from Skywatch TV, Ali Henson and Donna Howell, co-authors of the brand new book, Dark Covenant, and Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat will join us from Tel Aviv. And we will go places other tours will not. Joshua's Altar, Shiloh, Bethel, Gilgal Rephaim, the Stonehenge of the Middle East, and the Serpent Mound of Bashan. That will be some fascinating stuff. Find out more and reserve your place at lipkintours.com. Thank you for making time out of your schedule for this podcast. We know that your time is just as valuable as mine, and so I do appreciate that. Give us a like at our Facebook page, the View from the Bunker page, or leave a review. Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever else you find us, which is wherever fine podcasts are sold. Our announcer is DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.